This is the second lecture on content regulation, and we're going to be covering, among other things, obscenity and indecency and all those wonderful things that we hear about in broadcasting these days. So let's jump right into it. Now, when we talk about there is a difference, there's a distinction between obscenity and indecency. Excuse me, sorry. For one thing, obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment. Indecency is, and the courts are basically what has decided what the difference is between the two. When we talk about what is obscene, in 1973 there was a case called Miller that defined obscene as works which appeal to the prurient interest in sex and do not have serious literary, political, or scientific value. Indecent speech, on the other hand, whereas obscene speech has no First Amendment protection, remember, indecent speech, does have First Amendment protection, but can still be regulated. Now, state laws must carefully confine what they classify as obscene based on local community standards. So the courts, they consider what the average person might be thinking when applying contemporary community standards to potentially obscene material. Again, indecency, going back to obscenity, really obscenity censorship has been restricted mainly to hardcore pornography and mainly child pornography. Indecency is language or material that depicts patently offensive material as measured by contemporary community standards. Specifically, it talks about sexual or excretory activities or organs, and of course Howard Stern is infamous for his rather indecent material, I guess you could say. The Pacifica decision revolved around comedian George Carlin's legendary or infamous act, 7 Filthy Words, which was broadcast on radio in New York. Now, after that particular broadcast, the FCC argued that children, because the broadcast kind of occurred pretty much in the middle of the afternoon, so the FCC argued that children must be protected from objectionable content by channeling it to a part of the day when children are least likely to be in the audience. So the argument was that since his broadcast occurred during the day, children were in the audience, and therefore they were exposed to indecent material. So the Supreme Court actually upheld the FCC fine that it imposed on the station, and the FCC was able to implement what they called a safe harbor, during which indecent programming can be aired because it's safe, because children aren't likely to be awake during these times. That safe harbor is from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And again, these are hours that children are less likely to be part of the viewing or listening audience. Now, when it comes to enforcement of FCC rules, they say that indecency should be, again, channeled to times when children should not be the audience, and violators of who are not using the safe harbor should be fined up to $325,000. That fine number increased after the infamous Janet Jackson, Justin Timberlake wardrobe malfunction. And then before 2004, the commission generally didn't fine stations that aired an occasionally offensive word or when a word was used as an adjective or interjections in some other manner, because they usually held that it did not depict sexual or excretory activities. Now, after the 2004 Golden Globes, when lead singer of U2 emitted what is known as a fleeting expletive, even those suddenly became subject to fines. Now, the FCC has sort of applied this policy somewhat ad hoc, and many stations have challenged it in the courts, and there's still determining the viability of that policy. Indecency on cable is a little bit different because the courts have ruled, if we recall last time's lecture, the courts have recalled that courts, excuse me, the courts have said that cable is not as uniquely intrusive of broadcasting, is not as readily available. Okay, because subscribers actually choose to receive cable programming. Therefore, Pacifica does not apply to cable as much as it does to broadcasting. The Cable Act of 1984 did provide for fines or imprisonment for anyone who transmitted obscene material over a cable system, but remember, indecency is allowed, although somewhat regulated. Cable operators may prohibit, if they choose, indecency on public access channels. In 1996, Congress passed legislation that required cable operators to block fully the audio or video of channels primarily dedicated to sexually oriented programming. But then in 2000, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional, saying that there were less restrictive ways to protect children from indecent programming on cable. So while cable is still a little freer than broadcasting when it comes to indecency, there are still some restrictions. Now we're going to switch our focus and look at political restrictions when it comes to broadcasting or cable mediums. There are rules on political broadcasting. You are supposed to allow each candidate equal time, and this equal time law requires stations to treat advertising from all candidates equally. So for instance, when Arnold Schwarzenegger ran for governor in 2003, stations actually refrained from airing his movies because it could have been constrained as being unfair to his opponents, and therefore stations would have to give equal airtime to his opponents. That would have been a complete mess. So the FCC has interpreted equal time to require not only equal amounts of time, but also access to equivalent audiences and equal financial arrangements. For instance, allowing a favored candidate to run a 30-second spot during prime time on network TV station, but then turning around and only allowing his opponent to run an ad at 4 a.m. is not adhering to equal time. So in this instance, both candidates have technically had the same amount of time. Each had a 30-second spot, but the access to the same audience was not the same. So equal time means not only equal amount of time, but equal equivalent audiences. Now, when it comes to politics in broadcasting and candidates in the news, equal time does not really apply when it comes to news broadcasts because newscasts are not required to devote equal time to opposing candidates. There has been a little bit of question as to whether or not the FCC should apply that equal time opportunity to news coverage, but so far that hasn't happened. When it comes to political advertising, stations must offer candidates what is known as the lowest available rate when it comes to buying ad space, which has been somewhat a tricky problem when it comes to defining what is the lowest unit charge, because if you buy ad time in bulk, there are different rates versus if you buy only one or two spots. So that can be a little bit tricky to figure out what exactly is the lowest unit charge. Now, there was a policy known as the Fairness Doctrine, and this doesn't necessarily pertain exactly to politics, but it can. But the Fairness Doctrine obliged stations to schedule time for programs on controversial issues. Some could be political, some maybe not, but controversial issues of public importance to ensure expression of opposing views on those issues. And it was dropped in 1985 because the FCC finally ruled that it actually inhibited presentation of controversial issues.